Hi, everybody. Welcome to this exciting event this evening. My name is Catherine Fox, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Communications for the Children's Hospital Foundation of Manitoba. We're delighted that you are joining us this evening on this World Breastfeeding Week to hear from our incredible team of local experts at the Children's Hospital Research Institute of Manitoba from the MILC team. For those of you who aren't familiar with CHRIM, it is an absolute jewel here on the prairies. It is a pediatric research facility, interdisciplinary, with 270 plus extraordinary scientists, clinicians, and investigators like the group that you'll hear from this evening. And at the Children's Hospital Foundation of Manitoba, we are very proud to support the Research Institute and the investigators, and to be able to help in the very, very valuable work that folks like Dr. Azad and her team and the MILC team are doing. So without further ado, welcome to each of you. Thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to Nicole, Meghan, Natalie, and company. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. So once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's event. This is the CHRD public event, Human Milk, the Ultimate Superfood and Personalized Medicine. We will have a presentation and panel discussion featuring 7 experts from the Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center, or MILC, and I can't wait to introduce them shortly. My name is Nicole Fiorentino, and also with me today is my colleague Spencer Ames, if you want to wave to everyone, Spencer. We are both part of the Azad Lab and the MILC Club, and we will be your moderators for today's session. I do want to give our traditional territories acknowledgement. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the trees that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Just a little bit about MILC. MILC is a unique research consortium dedicated to understanding the biological and societal factors that influence breastfeeding and the mechanistic basis for the health benefits of human milk feeding for mothers and children. And the MILC Club is an interdisciplinary group of researchers, trainees, and knowledge users who are interested in breastfeeding, human milk, and lactation. We meet monthly to discuss our initiatives and share updates and catalyze knowledge mobilization. And all of the speakers and panelists that you will hear tonight and get to engage with tonight are MILC Club members, and they will talk a bit more about MILC later in the session. The format of tonight's session will be about a 20-minute presentation where our MILC experts will talk about exciting discoveries in human milk and lactation research. Sarah will talk about Breastfeeding in Schools project, and Dr. Catherine Kearns will talk about research translation to clinical care. The second part of our event will be a 30-minute panel discussion. We will open up the floor to questions from the audience, where you are invited to ask our MILC experts anything related to their research and expertise in human milk, lactation, breastfeeding, and chest feeding. We do ask that you keep your video off and your mic muted during the presentation to ensure better connection. And then during the panel discussion, you're welcome to raise your hand. There's a feature at the bottom. You can click on reactions, raise hand, and then we'll call on you to unmute yourself to ask your question. And if you don't mind being in the recording, you're also welcome to turn on your video during the panel portion. You are also welcome at any time to put your questions in the chat, and Spencer and I will make sure we get your questions to our panelists. And if you would also direct your questions to the right panelists, that would be helpful as well. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists for tonight's event. So first up, you will hear from our speaker, Dr. Meghan Azad. Dr. Azad is an associate professor of pediatrics and child health at the University of Manitoba and holds a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Developmental Origins of Chronic Disease. Her research program is focused on the role of infant nutrition and the microbiome in child growth, development, and resilience. Dr. Azad is also a co-director of MILC and also co-directs the new International Milk Composition Consortium. And next up, we have Natalie. Natalie Rodriguez, in an acclaimed career of truly transformative and translational work, Natalie has implemented new systems, technologies, platforms, initiatives, and discovery worldwide. Natalie is our Milk Operations Director and also co-directs the new International Milk Composition Consortium. Then we have Sarah Turner. Sarah is a Vanier Scholar and PhD student in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba. Her research focuses on how breast milk and breastfeeding contribute to child neurological development and behavioral outcomes. Then we have Dr. Catherine Kearns. Dr. Catherine Kearns is a family physician who works in breastfeeding medicine at the Winnipeg Breastfeeding Center, which she also co-founded in 2017 with Dr. Christina Raimondi, who I believe is on the session tonight. And this is the first of its kind in Manitoba. She does low-risk obstetrics, seeing moms and babies throughout the prenatal, intrapartum, and postpartum periods. And then we have our other panelists. Carol Dyck has an extensive background in public health nursing in Manitoba and BC. This work includes coordinating several pilot projects in perinatal and early childhood development. She is an instructor for the Douglas College Breastfeeding Education Programs, chair of the newly formed Manitoba Lactation and Breastfeeding Support Network, and on several Indigenous and settler relations committees. Then we have Janet McCauley. Janet is a registered midwife in the WRHA. She has been working as a midwife in Manitoba since 2006 and has a special interest in social justice, health equity, and especially as it applies to birthing folks and their babies. And last but not least, we have Dr. Merilee Brockway. Merilee is a PhD prepared registered nurse with expertise in maternal child health, infant feeding, and patient engagement. She completed her PhD in nursing at the University of Calgary, examining maternal breastfeeding self-efficacy and infant feeding outcomes in moderate and late preterm infants. Merilee is currently a postdoctoral researcher in the Azad lab and works on donor human milk for very preterm infants. And I think that's everyone. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Meghan and Natalie to kick us off with the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you, Catherine, for introducing our session tonight and for sponsoring the research at CHRIM, as well as the research days happening this week. So I'm really excited to see so many people signed up. Good evening for those of you in Manitoba, but good morning or good afternoon for those of you joining around the world. It's unfortunate that we still can't be together for conferences, but that also has the silver lining of enabling us to have a more global reach. And I know there were people registered from around the world joining us tonight, which is really exciting. So I'm excited to share with you some of our work and research and initiatives around breastfeeding. So I think especially right now, in the midst of a pandemic, this is an especially meaningful graphic for me. So breast milk can be considered a baby's first vaccine. And so you might not know that babies are born with very immature immune systems. And so they rely on mother's milk, not just for nutrients to grow and develop, but also for immunity. And so they're getting antibodies from their mother's milk, and that includes COVID antibodies. So in the last year, there's been a lot of research on initially whether the virus is spread through breast milk. The answer is no. And then after that is immune protection against the virus spread through breast milk. And so we now know that maternal antibodies to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is transmitted from a mom to a baby, whether she's been previously infected and recovered from the virus or vaccinated. And so this is just one example of how breastfeeding is really important beyond what we think of initially, which is breast milk as a food, which of course it is. But it's not, just a food, it's truly a superfood. So this is maybe a buzzword lately, but I think that in the case of breast milk, it really is true. So it contains literally all the nutrients that a baby needs to grow and develop for the first 6 months of life. And breastfeeding is recommended well beyond that for the many other benefits that it conveys. But thinking about those very first few days, some people call colostrum, the very first breast milk, the original liquid gold. And I think, again, this is not an over-exaggeration in the case of breast milk. So it actually is a sort of golden color. So it's a fitting name for it. But colostrum in particular, that very first milk in the first couple of days, contains extremely high concentrations of these antibodies, other growth factors, and particular factors that are needed for babies to initiate their growth and development. So colostrum in particular, we're still learning a lot about. And so here's a last image that I like, and then maybe you'll think about after you leave today, that making milk is really a superpower. when you think about it. You're making a vaccine for your baby, you're making a superfood, and you're making this liquid gold that puts them off to the very right start in life. So these are some of the reasons why I get excited about breast milk. And here are some of the statistics. So this is a map showing the percent of child mortality, so child deaths under 5 years of age around the world that can be attributable to suboptimal breastfeeding. So this is from a large global database where every death in the world is categorized and attributed to a cause. So whether it's cancer or heart disease or COVID, for example. In the case of children, you can see here that in some countries, so I've highlighted down here South Africa, almost 20% of all child deaths are actually attributable to suboptimal breastfeeding. And you'll see why in a moment that might be, because breastfeeding is protective against a number of diseases, particularly infectious diseases, which are still a major cause of death in countries in low and middle income settings. So these are data from 2013. This is not many years ago. This is pretty recent. And so when you see data like this, where up to 20%, but even 10 or 15% of child deaths being attributable to this one practice, which is modifiable, that right there tells you why it's important to study. And so in a recent series in The Lancet, all about breastfeeding and global data, there was an estimate made that improving breastfeeding practices around the world could save more than 820,000 lives a year. And so if you're interested to learn more about breastfeeding after tonight's session, this would be a really great place to start. They've really collated all the evidence around the health benefits and also the economic benefits of breastfeeding in one place. Now, of course, we're coming to you today from Canada, and although Canada is nice and blue on this map, meaning that fewer than 1 or 2% of child deaths are attributable to suboptimal breastfeeding, there are other reasons to care about breastfeeding beyond child mortality. And so this is a graphic or a poster from Manitoba Health in the province where we live, and it lists 8 great reasons to breastfeed your baby. And of course, we have limited time today, so we won't cover all of them. But the one that we tend to focus on in our research is around the health benefits of breastfeeding for babies. Now, of course, you can see there are other reasons here to breastfeed, but if we think just about this one, just about the health benefits, breastfed babies have a 36% lower risk of sudden infant death syndrome. They have a 72% lower risk of respiratory tract infections during infancy. But it's not just in infancy that these benefits are experienced. So breastfed children have a 30% lower risk of type 1 diabetes later in childhood. And if we extend out even further, breastfed individuals have a 15 to 30% reduced risk of obesity later in life in adolescence or adulthood. So there are many benefits across the lifespan to being breastfed as an infant. And actually, I would add a 9th reason, which really is the reason that I personally got interested in breastfeeding, which has to do with our microbiome. So this paper is now almost a decade old, but it was, as I say, my gateway into breastfeeding. So back in 2013, I was working with the child cohort study, studying the infant microbiome, so the bacteria that live in and on our bodies and that we're learning to appreciate as microbes that help keep us healthy. And what we found when we studied the microbiomes of babies was that a really important, arguably the most important factor shaping the microbiome was breastfeeding. And this was shown really beautifully in several other studies since then. And one in particular that I love is this one featured on the cover of Nature in 2018, where they were able to quantify various different factors that were influencing the microbiome of babies. And you can see here that by far and away, breast milk is the most important, really dwarfing all of these other factors, many of which are known and appreciated to be quite important for the microbiome. So for example, taking probiotics or receiving antibiotics or being born by C-section really influence the microbiome, but still all of that really pales in comparison to receiving breast milk as an infant. So this is one of the reasons that I get really excited about breast milk. And so a few interesting facts. This is an image that you won't be able to read the words, which is not important, but it really shows you that the ingredients, so to speak, in breast milk are so much more numerous than what is currently found in infant formula. And it's not important to read the words, but I think that this image really gives you that sense. So human milk or breast milk is dynamic. That's one of the things that even if we could figure out all of these different ingredients in breast milk, and we're still discovering new ones, and put them into an infant formula, it wouldn't truly replicate breast milk because it would be, static. One can of formula, it doesn't change. Whereas human milk itself actually varies over time on different scales. So it varies diurnally, meaning from morning to night. Milk changes according to the time of day. It changes even within one feeding. So the milk at the beginning of a feed has lower fat content than the milk at the end of a feed, and that's thought to be important for infants in learning to regulate their appetite. It varies across lactation, so the milk produced in the first few days or few weeks is different from the milk produced later on as the infant grows, so it's changing to match what that infant needs over time. And it varies among mothers, so not every mom, even with a baby of the same age, is making the same milk, so it's kind of personalized for that individual infant. It's personalized when you think about the nutrition, so what that human infant needs, and it's also personalized when you think about the medicinal component. So we talked about immunity early on, and this really is something that is personalized to the environment of that mother and baby. And so the other thing that some people don't actually recognize is formula is made from cow's milk, and milk is very species specific. So all mammals are making milk, but the milk for each species is optimized to that species. So if you imagine a baby calf, it gets up almost right away and starts wobbling around. So it needs milk that's going to help its muscles grow really strong. Whereas a human infant isn't walking around for many months. It's actually spending a lot of its first weeks and months of life relatively still and having its brain grow. So human milk is optimized for brain growth. And so feeding milk from one species to another is not optimal and not well matched. I think we probably don't have time for interactivity today, but you can think of this in your own minds. So I wonder if, not being able to read this picture, you can think of things that are in human milk that are not found in infant formula. And so as you're doing that, maybe some of these things come to mind. So this is another picture showing a similar message that formula contains the building blocks a baby needs to grow. But there are many components of breast milk that aren't found in formula. So that includes things like maternal antibodies, hormones, growth factors, enzymes. None of these are found in formula. And this photo or image is maybe a little bit out of date because it doesn't contain some of my very favorite components, including things like probiotic bacteria. So probiotic meaning beneficial. We now know that breast milk from healthy mothers contains live beneficial bacteria for the infant. Prebiotic oligosaccharides. So these are complex carbohydrates or fibers that are food for those beneficial bacteria. So they're not food from the baby. The baby can't digest them, but the baby's microbes are digesting these specific oligosaccharides found in human milk. Human milk is also known to contain stem cells, which is pretty interesting, as well as food antigens. And some of our research pertains to food allergies. And so we're learning about how the food antigens from the mother's diet can be transmitted in breast milk and potentially help to prevent allergies in the baby. So I won't be going into detail into any of this research, but if you're interested, you could visit the Child Study website. So a lot of the research that our team has done in the last decade has been with the child cohort study. And there's a website of key discoveries where you can click on the breastfeeding section and see summaries of this different research. So for example, we found in our study that breastfed infants have a lower risk of obesity as they grow up. We've found that breastfed babies who are fed by mothers who eat peanuts seem to have a lower risk of peanut allergies, and so on. So there have been many really neat discoveries, some of them related to pumping, and you can read more about them at our website. So I'm going to now turn it over to Natalie Rodriguez, the co-director of our program, to tell you about a really exciting international study that we've been directing over the last year or so called IMIC.
Thanks so much, Megan. So IMIC, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, spans 4 countries. Nepal, Burkina Faso, Pakistan, and Canada. We're collecting 2,000 samples in the study from 1,000 mother-infant diets. IMIC really takes the approach of personalized medicine a step further. So as Megan has mentioned, breast milk has many components. Previously, there had been studies that looked at these components individually. However, nobody had really looked at them together. So IMIC is the first study of its kind that looks at all of the components of breast milk comprehensively as a system. We're then taking it a step further and combining harmonized metadata, including interventions such as nicotinamide, antibiotics, prebiotics, and maternal factors such as nutrition, infection, stress. And we're adding infant health data, whether it be growth, body composition, nutritional status, gut health, neuro and immune development. We're working with lab partners across the globe to analyze macro and micronutrients, human milk oligosaccharides, targeted and untargeted metabolomics, proteomics, and pathogens. And finally, we're layering on machine learning with our collaborators at UC Berkeley and Stanford to develop predictive models such as growth trajectories, And this allows us to determine differences in milk composition based on geographical location and diet. So why does all of this matter? It's cool science, but it's important to us that we're doing more than just cool science. It needs to be impactful. So in countries such as Pakistan, 60% of infants will experience growth stunting by the age of 6 months. In Burkina Faso, many premature infants without a wet nurse will fail to survive. So IMIC offers us an opportunity to understand why this is happening and how we can optimize nutrition for infants who can't be breastfed or those that are currently failing to achieve optimal growth in various settings. So how do we make all of this happen? Well, breast milk is temperature sensitive. So similar to COVID vaccines, which made the news this year, they need to be shipped at -80. Figuring out how to ship samples across the world from the Ivory Coast or as far as Innisbrook and have them remain frozen has been a logistical challenge that we've overcome. We have smart freezers in milk, which Meghan will talk about a bit later. And those allow us to be sure that these precious samples remain safe. So we can tell if a freezer is open or closed. If the freezers were to go down, we receive notifications on our cell phone or via email. Some components of breast milk are even light sensitive, so we've had to develop protocols for collection in the field site. In some areas, low middle income settings, such as Burkina Faso, there's unreliable power sources. So we've actually had to use the first of their kind rechargeable breast pumps in the field to facilitate collection of breast milk. And this had to be arranged and shipped out during the height of the COVID pandemic. We built a virtual database to support this study to allow data sharing between collaborators. And we're really leveraging innovative technology in the milk biorepository. We have matrix cryotubes with scannable QR codes and barcodes. And this becomes important because these are precious samples. We have a limited amount of each sample. And so we've had to really optimize available volumes that we received. And every time we receive a sample, it's sub-aliquoted 5 times for distribution by partner labs. So 2,000 samples quickly becomes 10,000 samples. And all of this is managed by Kelsey Fair, our biorepository technician, who's absolutely amazing. And so we use cryo labels, we scan individual tubes and racks using a barcode scanner. And all of that information goes into a laboratory information management system at CHRIM. And this allows us to track samples as they make their way across the globe. All of this has contributed to Manitoba becoming a hub and world leader in breast milk research. And now I'll let Meghan tell you a little bit about milk.
Thanks, Natalie. So MILC is the Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center. It's co-directed by myself and my colleague, Nathan Nickel. And you can see here that we bring complementary expertise to this center. So I have a background in biochemistry and genetic and more recently human milk science, as well as epidemiology. And Nathan has a background in public health and biostatistics. So together, we're able to tackle questions about human milk and breastfeeding in ways that many other research teams wouldn't be able to do. And so there are 3 main components of milk. One is the biorepository that Natalie just described with the state-of-the-art tubes and smart freezers and equipment and milk analyzers. Another is our feeding database. So interestingly, in Canada, including in Manitoba, there's no population level surveillance system for breastfeeding rates. So we don't actually know in a great level of detail how long mothers are breastfeeding and how that is changing over time, or perhaps in response to different public health policies. So with this database, we'll be able to address those types of questions. And then both the milk and the data that we're collecting is linked into the Manitoba Population Research Data Repository, which is a unique research center in Manitoba that has administrative records from hospitals, from physician billing claims, from prescription records, even from school performance and other social services linked and available for research. So once we tie in our milk and feeding data to that excellent resource, we'll be able to do things like understand how milk composition is linked to infant health over time, or linked to maternal health looking back in time. So this is going to be a really powerful platform for milk research in Manitoba. In addition to milk research, Natalie mentioned we want to make sure we're making an impact. And so that comes down to knowledge translation. So we, of course, publish research papers, but we also do things like speak to the media and the general public. We've helped develop some education courses for healthcare providers internationally. Last year, I was part of a committee from the National Academies of Science and Engineering in Medicine, and we did a commissioned report on the evidence around the nutrient content of human milk. We've made some great animated videos with help from the child cohort study to describe the science around human milk. And some of our members have done commentaries on issues related to breastfeeding and the pandemic. So all of this is to help us spread the knowledge that we're generating to different audiences that need to know about it. And so on the same topic, I'm going to turn it over to a PhD student in our lab, Sarah Turner, who's working on a knowledge outreach project in schools. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Megan. So yes, Megan's totally right. We have so much great knowledge about breastfeeding and why human milk is really great for babies. But there is definitely a need to translate this knowledge not only to moms, but just to the public in general, so that we can foster social support for breastfeeding. And you might not know that although almost 100% of Canadian moms initiate breastfeeding, we have over 90%, only 35% of moms are continuing to breastfeed for the recommended duration of 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding. So we do still have a gap here in Canada. And part of this is due to social stigma and lack of social support. Most of the breastfeeding education currently is targeted towards mothers, but we believe that education, early education, so education going all the way back into elementary, junior high, or high schools, is really a time when attitudes and beliefs are formed and could be a really fruitful time for targeting breastfeeding education. So our goal is that moms don't feel that they have to breastfeed in the bathroom like this mom is doing in this image, but that they can feel really well supported to be able to breastfeed wherever they need to. So our breastfeeding education in Manitoba schools project has 2 phases. The first one is complete and the second one is ongoing. So back a couple years ago, we did a scan of the curriculum in Manitoba, and not surprisingly, we found that there are not any breastfeeding educational resources that are currently being taught in public schools. However, there have been toolkits that have been developed in Canada, in the US, and in the UK that give teachers ideas of ways to insert breastfeeding into the curriculum to make it easy and manageable to include in all types of subjects like social studies, science, or even math. We then did a survey with stakeholders that included educators and healthcare providers to see if there was an appetite for promoting this in schools, maybe developing some resources and implementing some resources in schools. So we're currently working on phase 2 of the project, which is ongoing now, and we're collaborating with U of M faculty from the Department of Education to modify and create resources that would teach about breastfeeding in schools that would be Manitoba specific. We also are currently working on providing materials to teachers, so through things like professional development days, circulating existing resources that already are out there, but maybe teachers just don't know about them. And then eventually in the future, our idea and hope would be to implement and then evaluate some of these resources to see if they really are changing knowledge, beliefs, and attitudes of students under the age of 18, so they're still kids, and how this might influence their breastfeeding knowledge and beliefs as they grow up. So just a little bit more about phase 1, about our online survey. When we talked to educators and healthcare providers, they were really highly in support of talking about breastfeeding in schools. So you can see that 97% of educators and 94% of healthcare providers thought that this should be something that we talk about in public schools. And a couple of the reasons that they mentioned were to normalize breastfeeding in the public, to prepare students as future parents, and to provide accurate information about the benefits, the challenges, and the choices associated with breastfeeding. And so that people can be informed when the time comes for them to be feeding babies, they're informed and they can make a good choice for what's best for them and their baby. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Catherine Kearns, and she's going to talk about the really amazing work being done at the Winnipeg Breastfeeding Center.
Hi, is my video not turning on?
Nope, you look great.
Oh, it's just not in my little box. Okay, so as mentioned in the beginning, me and Dr. Christina Raimondi started the Winnipeg Breastfeeding Center, and we're physicians, both family physicians with specialty in breastfeeding medicine, sort of the goal being evidence-based support for Manitoba families, and meeting families where they're at and trying to help them meet their goals. We do in-person and virtual care. We're on Instagram, and we have a website. So there we go for that. So I guess the question on the clinical side is, why do we do research in the first place, right? Why are these things important to learn? And so we want to improve knowledge in general, obviously, but also to be able to improve care, improve support to people, and building advocacy, and then of course system change and societal changes like discussed already. So it matters, right? Babies need to eat, of course, number one, but what they eat matters. And so breast milk matters, exclusive breastfeeding matters. We know through research that reduces risk for babies of SIDS, infections, respiratory and GI, decreasing hospital admissions and ICU admissions for these. Decreases obesity, asthma, allergy, also childhood leukemia. Exclusive breastfeeding decreases childhood leukemia by 19%, which is a pretty big deal. And then of course, diabetes type 1 and 2. And then it matters for the milk producer, you know, breastfeeding, chest feeding, all of these. So it matters for that person, the feeder, milk producer, for decreasing obesity, sort of rebalancing after a pregnancy, decreases risks of hypertension, high blood pressure. And actually the review that looked at that had grouped research that included both exclusive and some breastfeeding. And that effect was for 20, 30 years. So these are important topics to know and important motivations that help families understand why what the baby eating matters. And then of course, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, postpartum depression, and recovery postpartum. So it was alluded to earlier, this is really small on this program, of course, but you know, there needs to be societal change, and public needs to understand better how important it is to feed babies and to be able to do that in public. And it doesn't always look, or it isn't always very easy for a mom to latch a baby on and have them just feed. And so some moms have issues and have some difficulties and have to help them or use a shield or different things. And if that societal piece is not accepting of being able to see any of that, and it's just not even doable with a cover on. So as mentioned already, the breastfeeding rates, go back. Rates in Canada, the initiation starts very high, and then the numbers just go down. And part of that is the systemic support, right? And well, everywhere in the system. And we'll talk about barriers in a minute, but the point is that we all need to do more to help these numbers and to help those, because the motivation is there, right? The understanding of the health benefits and the motivation for most families, the vast majority of families, is there, but we need to do more to support them. And part of that is research so that they're motivated to get through issues they might have, or research into what factors are affecting. Meghan mentioned Nathan and some of the work on his side of things, right? With the society and the healthcare system and the population research that helps us determine what we can do differently to improve things after even parents have decided to try. Next one. It matters for human rights. So breastfeeding is actually in the Human Rights Code of Manitoba and of Canada. I'm not sure about other countries, though I suspect it's in there under the gender section. And so anything related to pregnancy and breastfeeding is protected. And it's important to know these things. And the research helps to, again, understand how we can meet these goals. Next one. So how do we support families' choices, right? So there are multiple factors playing a role. And again, we're talking from research standpoint tonight, and part of it is doing research to understand the components of milk and you know, the differences and the health effects and the health benefits and all these things. But it's also going the other way as well, right? So we want to translate the research into clinical practice and have these conversations with families so they understand, so they can make an informed choice as to whether they want to breastfeed and sustain the breastfeeding and exclusive and bottles and all these things. And then also the clinical practice piece can also inform research, which is something we do. Meghan mentioned the Milk Club, and we are in the Milk Club. And so we have conversations about what is important to look into and what is important that we do. And an example with our clinic would be where we, with tongue ties, right? So we do tongue tie releases when there is a clear it is clear that it's affecting the feeding or causing problems for breastfeeding. And, Dr. Melanie Morris, pediatric surgeon, comes and does them. And we were doing this and having conversations with families and realizing really some of the information out there and understanding of some of these things is not great. And so that then informed us to do research on that piece and work on that. So having informed clinical practice, having clinical practice, informed research, that's sort of everybody working together, which is really the ideal. So next slide, barriers. Again, from the clinical perspective, there are lots of barriers. And I don't think anybody would be surprised by this, given the numbers you've heard tonight, with over 90% dropping off so significantly after initiation. And so certainly lots of areas where lots of us can do and make a difference for women. So, and their families and sorry, not just women, but chest feeders as well, and help them and support them through the process. I mean, there is a reason for the expression, it takes a village to raise a child. Part of that is to support and establish breastfeeding, because yes, it's instinctive. And yes, we all have reflexes to make this happen, but certainly the milk maker might not have fed before, and the baby certainly's never fed before because they're new, and they've certainly never done it together. And so you can assume there's going to be a learning curve, and if that is not supported, or there are too many other stressors, that can be difficult. Next slide. So this is just the 10 steps to successful breastfeeding in Canada. Now this is for healthcare systems and healthcare departments. And, I'm not going to go through them completely. If you guys want to read them more closely, well, you can find them on either of these websites, but you could also take a screenshot. But I'll go to the next one. And just this is, every single person on this call and everybody fits in here somewhere under one of these labels. And so we're celebrating World Breastfeeding Week, and it's incumbent on all of us to do things to improve our numbers and improve the beneficial feeding of infants with breast milk. And then here's some places you can find more information. These are good resources. And yeah, so I'll hand it back.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Sarah, Natalie, for joining me in the presentation. And I'll turn it over to Nicole to moderate the question and answer period.
Thank you all for your excellent presentations. I've heard you all speak many times now, and I always learn something new each time. So that's always great. So now we'd like to move into the panel discussion. So on the screen, you'll see all of our panelists with their expertise highlighted in purple to remind you who you might want to direct your question to. You can raise your hand and we can call on you, and you can unmute yourself and ask one of our panelists your questions yourself, or you can type your questions into the chat at any time, and Spencer and I will make sure that they get answered. So I will go ahead and start us off. This will be a question for Meghan, Natalie, and Sarah. So what do you guys perceive to be the biggest barriers in breast milk research? If one of you want to start on that.
Boy, how much time do we have? There are many, and I think probably each of us can speak to one. So I think one that I would highlight as kind of the scientist and the data cruncher is that milk has so many components. Like, it's truly a system. And in the past, the way milk was studied was often by individual experts. So, an expert in lipids would study the fats in milk, and an expert in hormones would study the hormones in milk. But what that misses, that approach, is the fact that all these things exist together in the complex matrix of milk. And so we're really trying to push the envelope with how we perceive milk. And now that we do have the technologies to measure all of these things in kind of great detail, the challenge becomes the data analysis. So how do we put all of those data sets together and make sense of them all? And so Natalie described the IMIC project, where we're really excited to be working with some machine learning experts who do artificial intelligence. And so they're bringing their expertise to human milk research, which is really exciting, and I think is going to lead to kind of a new frontier of discovery and of understanding milk as a system.
Yeah, I would add that from a study design perspective, one of the challenges with studying breastfeeding is that you cannot randomize a mom to say, you breastfeed, you don't. One of the best ways for us to get evidence about causal relationships between any exposure, so that can be breastfeeding and an outcome, let's say child asthma, is to randomize that exposure. But we cannot do that with breastfeeding. And so we have to look to other study designs, looking at many different ways of looking at breastfeeding with different child outcomes in order to see if do they all line up? Do they all match up when we look at it many different ways? And then that gives us confidence that, yeah, breastfeeding really is making an impact.
Yeah, and I would add to what both Meghan and Sarah said. A lot of the research that we're doing is in the discovery space, which means, one barrier is that no one's done it before. And so you're often, navigating and breaking new ground as you go. And, to fund these large scale studies, it does take a tremendous amount of funding. And even if you have funding, that's not always the answer. So in low middle income environments, at one point we thought, well, we're going to collect samples. And they said, well, we only have one freezer. And we're like, okay, great. So we have funding, we'll buy another freezer. But without reliable electricity, the freezer didn't matter. And so you encounter barriers that aren't even conceivable to some of us in high income countries. And so it's working with collaborators, both to improve infrastructure and resource, but to understand the unique barriers that, each of our countries and stakeholders are facing.
Thank you all. I think Spencer has a
All right.
question for you.
Yeah, so excellent presentation, guys. I had a question related to mothers that cannot breastfeed and donor milk. And will donor milk have the same benefits as a mother's own milk? And if there are any challenges associated with that. So this is a general question for any of you guys to answer. Maybe Merilee or Meghan can give a response.
I can start, Spencer, and very good question. So as Dr. Kearns and Sarah both identified, we have very, very high breastfeeding initiation rates, but drop-offs are considerable in those first months. And often it's because women struggle with breastfeeding. Maybe they can't breastfeed. Biologically, that's quite rare, but we have a lot of social influences that impact breastfeeding. And when that happens, we have to look at alternatives for breast milk. And the World Health Organization kind of stratifies what's the best alternatives. The first being breast milk directly from the breast or chest. The second being mom's own breast milk extracted and fed via a feeding system. And then we have donor human milk is the third best option, and then formula. So I'm sure probably everybody on the call is familiar with formula, and Meghan identified why formula is perhaps not as good as human milk or breast milk. And so we've had a resurgence of donor human milk in probably the last couple decades that is available to infants who can't receive their mom's own breast milk. And right now that's kind of held for babies that are vulnerable, such as preterm infants or babies who have medical concerns. But we do have 4 human milk banks in Canada that safely collect breast milk from donor moms who are screened, and then that milk is pasteurized to ensure that it's safe to provide to babies, safe from a bacteriological, so there's no contaminants or anything, or viral concern as well to make the baby sick. It's not as good as mom's own milk or raw milk that's not pasteurized, but it is really becoming a very easily accessible option for most babies. And we're even looking at making it available to babies who don't have high risks.
Thank you, Merilee. Did Meghan, you want to comment on that question?
Well, Merilee didn't mention one of the exciting research projects she has going. So as she mentioned, there's challenges with donor milk because it has to be pasteurized. So there is firstly a lot of research going on about how can we optimally treat the milk so that it's safe for the babies, but also preserve the bioactivity of the many different important components of milk. So that's one area of active research. Another area that we're thinking about is when a mom is donating her extra milk to the milk bank, and then that milk is eventually given to a baby. Right now, the way it works in Canada is that milk from several donors is pooled together, and then it's given to all the babies that need it. And it's not a fair exact comparison, but when you think about blood donors, we don't take all the blood, mix it together, and then just give it to everyone. We analyze the blood, we do the blood type, and then we give it to a person of the same blood type. So we're thinking about whether a similar concept might be applicable to milk, and we're leading a study to look at that. It was just about to get started when the pandemic hit, so it's a little bit slow to get going, but we're hoping that soon as things calm down, we'll be able to start recruiting, and that will be the first study in the world to look at this type of matching for mothers' donor milk and recipient babies. So lots of exciting stuff happening in the area of donor milk.
Very exciting. I see a question in the chat, but I also saw Maureen put your video on. Did you have a question to ask Maureen?
No, it was really a comment, and that it is that we shouldn't underestimate the importance of breastfeeding itself. I think one of the unique things that these researchers come up with there is that breastfeeding is better direct from the breast in many ways than feeding ex-breast milk. But there was another issue that keeps coming up. Someone said formula is perhaps not as good. One of the successes of the formula industry has been to align itself so closely with breast milk that people believe that it's basically breast milk in a bottle, and all the immune research that's been done is actually being taken over by the industry by adding a couple of bits and pieces to formula. There is a danger with education that if we aren't clear about saying that formula is risky, that we will in fact encourage that same assumption that, well, yes, formula is okay, which the companies, and is equivalent to breast milk. They've marketed it that way for a very long time. And so when I hear people saying a 19% reduction in leukemia risk, I want to hear it as a 25% increase in risk. Formula is not the norm from which we should be showing we can lower the risk. We should be talking about it as that which increases the risk. So education in schools could backfire if in fact we were not prepared to talk accurately about where the risk arises and to what extent it increases. Because, for instance, it doubles the risk of maternal problems in some studies. That's not something that's said. We talk about it as halving the risk. Sorry, I didn't intend to comment actually, so I'm not prepared.
We're always happy to hear from you. And I'm so pleased that you're joining all the way from Australia. That is a really good point. And that was when Nicole asked the first question, one of the biggest challenges in research on breastfeeding, that was one of the things that comes to mind too, is how do you frame the results? Because on the one hand, you want to be truthful and you want to show that there is a really important impact. At the same time, you want to be cautious of how the moms are feeling who can't breastfeed. And I think that goes to the next question I see in the chat around resources for moms who are struggling. But maybe before I pass that one on, I see that Merilee has her hand up to comment.
Yeah, no, thank you, Maureen. Those were really good comments. I do want to just pick up on what you said about the importance of direct breastfeeding and kind of guide the conversation back to one of Meghan's studies, which is probably one of the cooler studies I've seen come out of our lab from a personal perspective, is the importance of direct breastfeeding and how direct breastfeeding has an impact on asthma outcomes compared to expressing breast milk and feeding it in a bottle compared to formula feeding. So I think one of the challenges, again, going back to breastfeeding research, is defining what breastfeeding is and operationalizing or saying, what is breastfeeding? It used to be, are you breastfeeding? Yes, no. But it's really, really important to pick that question apart and know, are you direct breastfeeding? Are you exclusively breastfeeding? So really being careful and conscious about how you define what breastfeeding is.
Great. Thank you, Maureen, for that comment. I want to get to more questions. So I'm going to direct this one in the chat to Janet. Catherine Fox asks, what kind of resources would you recommend to moms who may be having challenges or need some help with breastfeeding?
That's a good question. I know that here, I can speak to what we do here in Winnipeg and in Manitoba. And all of these things have been greatly affected by the pandemic. So pre-pandemic in the before times, there's always been the breastfeeding clinic with Dr. Kearns and Dr. Raimondi and her group that we've been able to refer people to. And then there's also been, for folks who don't have midwifery care, the option to have public health nurses visit the home. Unfortunately, there were cuts to some really good things, I think, that were happening in Winnipeg, where there was a breastfeeding clinic on site at the Women's Hospital, where people could access breastfeeding help right in the downtown area, and that no longer exists. So for people needing help, I think one of the things that midwives try to do, because we do see people throughout the childbearing year and give care to the parent-infant dyad up to 6 weeks postpartum, is to try to tackle that problem before it happens. And that means to talk about infant feeding early, to ask about it at one of the first visits, to talk about people's feelings about infant feeding, to talk about what their family has done in terms of infant feeding. So if they've seen people feed babies at the breast, then that's great. And then also sort of trying to identify barriers. I think for me as a midwife, a lot of the barriers that I see are socioeconomic and have to do with people who have unstable housing, who don't have money. And I think it's important to understand the kind of learning a brand new skill when you're immediately postpartum can be really difficult when you're under the effects of things like crushing poverty and racism and colonialism. So don't have colonialism and don't have capitalism, and those are really good places to start. And then have good comprehensive care that is client-centered from the beginning of the pregnancy. And then if that doesn't work, then giving people the gift of time. 15-minute appointments are not enough to help people with breastfeeding.
Thanks,
I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's a start.
Absolutely. I wonder if Catherine, as a family physician, you could also comment on this, and then we'll go to Carol after that.
I think I mirror most of what Janet said. It's just a lot of the resources went away, even groups. We know that peer support is important for breastfeeding success. And so a lot of the groups that were happening around the city of Winnipeg, like she said, went away and they haven't come back, unfortunately, yet. I know that public health is going back into homes now, so that's good. But yeah, just and I go back to that page I had, that slide with all the areas where we could do better. And so just working in where we can all have an impact on things. But yeah, just there's a lot more online support now too. The problem is, of course, you get misinformation there too. So going to good sources.
Carol?
Yeah, so I'm just going to add, as an educator, we have certainly had to change our way of educating about breastfeeding, which we at first thought we weren't quite sure it was going to go, but it actually has been going very well. And we are getting double and triple the number of students that are going through our virtual program now through Douglas College, which is based in BC. So, and they're all very excited about getting onto the bandwagon and being able to support our family. So I'm excited about that. I think also we've now started a Manitoba run lactation and breastfeeding network. And we've had some good discussions in terms of where some of the gaps are. And also how can we look at the different resources and work smarter, work better together, so that more of the gaps will be filled. There's still a lot of gaps, but I'm excited that we can we're starting to see the end of the tunnel in terms of pandemic impact, and really hoping that there'll be some more support out there for people.
Thanks, Carol. And since we've got you on the spotlight, I wonder if you could just comment on some current trends you're seeing in chest or breastfeeding support and how, as an instructor, how you've seen this impact lactation education.
Yeah, I think it's part of our education is just letting our potential breastfeeding supporters out there, all the different options there are. Like we talked, or somebody mentioned earlier on that we used to talk about breastfeeding and then bottle feeding, and there's kind of nothing in between. And now with all the different choices that there are, all the research that's there, and the better access to information, there's a lot of requests for, what are the different ways I can feed my baby? And so we really, as an educator and a supporter, need to be knowledgeable about that, and also to make sure that they are given the information that couples need in order to support that breastfeeding plan, or find someone in the community, like the Winnipeg Breastfeeding Center, for instance, who could help with, more challenging situations.
And before we close out, because we're almost at time already, Carol, did you want to describe a bit more about the network that you're chairing, the new network?
Okay, so this was an offshoot of the Winnipeg Breastfeeding Network that has been going for some time. And when I moved back to BC 2 years ago, or back from BC to Manitoba 2 years ago, they needed somebody to kind of chaired that committee. So we started off as a Winnipeg Breastfeeding Network, and then with the pandemic and having to go through Zoom calls, we really felt that maybe we should go for a Manitoba-wide group, because basically if we're using media anyways, we could easily meet as a whole group. And I know our group is still relatively small, and we're hoping that once the pandemic eases off in terms of the workload, that we can increase our numbers and just talk about things, what's happening, and what kind of support is out there.
Thanks, Carol. So we've got about a minute left. If anyone has another question, go ahead and raise your hand and unmute yourself. I just wanted to get maybe some closing comments from our panelists before we end tonight's session.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to kind of wrap up. I want to thank everyone, all of our panelists and speakers, for being here tonight to share your expertise and knowledge about all the many different aspects of breastfeeding. I think we've had a really good flavor of the milk science, but also the translation into the clinic. Dr. Kearns described our milk club and the fact that I think it's wonderful we're in regular contact with the clinicians. That wasn't always true for my research program, and it's made such a difference in terms of understanding what are the important questions to be asking, and who are the important people that need to know the answers. And just in the flavor of people you see on the screen right now, which is only a fraction of our milk club in our lab, we have a PhD student, we have a public health nurse, we have a midwife, we have a physician, we have an epidemiologist, we have an MBA. So it really takes an interdisciplinary team to do this kind of impactful research. And it makes me so proud to see all of you here today participating in this event. And so it also makes me really excited to see how many people registered. And I know there were several requests to have the recording later on. So I think this is really the tip of the iceberg, but it's been really fun to share some of our research with all of you today. And I hope that you will reach out. You can visit the website milkresearch.com, shown on the screen there. And we'd love to hear from people who either have ideas, want to get involved, want to spread the word. So thank you for being here tonight. And thank you, Nicole, for organizing.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Right.
Bye.